Welcome, everyone. Everyone should be familiar with the guidelines, but just in case you're not, all participants enjoy the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Please not unmute and mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and when it will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on participants and unmute their microphone. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rasheen Foley via the chat box, rfoley@ctps.org, or 857-702-3704. I'll also read the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Rasheen Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org, or 857-702-3704. All right, we'll go ahead and do introductions. I said it. Welcome, everyone. Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and read the roll?
Okay, Mass DOT Chair.
Steve Wolfel here for Secretary and CEO, MassDOT Stephanie Pollock.
Mass DOT C2. Okay. Mass DOT Highway Division. Okay, MBTA.
Hi, Samantha Silver from the MBTA.
Thank you. Massport, Massachusetts Port Authority. Okay. Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Good morning. This is Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Great, thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian Kane, present. Good morning.
Morning, thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council here. Thanks.
Thanks. City of Boston, BTD.
Tom Katz's, City of Boston, representing Mayor Martin Walsh. Good morning.
Morning, thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hi, Jim Fitzgerald with the BPDA representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston.
Thank you. At-large City of Everett.
Morning, Jay Monty, City of Everett, representing Mayor Di Maria.
Thank you. At-large City of Newton.
Good morning. This is David Kozas, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Thank you. At-large Town of Arlington.
Hi, this is Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, at-large town, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
Thank you. At-large Town of Brookline. Okay. Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Inner Core.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Happy New Year, Thatcher Keyser, City of Framingham, representing Mayor Spicer.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Good morning, Darlene Nguyen, City of Beverly, representing Mayor Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin, who in turn represents the North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland.
Good morning, Jen Constable, Town of Rockland, representing South Shore Coalition.
Great, thank you. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Good morning, Pete Pelletier, Town of Medway.
Thank you. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the Town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Great, thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway Administration.
Thank you. Federal Transit Administration. Okay, that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Next time on the agenda is Chair's Report. I don't have one other than to say I hope everyone had a great holiday and good to see everyone. I will now turn it over to Tegan, Agenda Item 3, Executive Director's Report. Go ahead, Tegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to say welcome back, everyone, after the holidays. But I also wanted to add, if you don't mind, at the beginning of my report, just also an extra thanks to all of you board members and also others who are joining the meeting. Especially in the context of not just the challenges of the last year, but also in the last few days. And I hope everyone's found some space to sort of process and catch up on sleep, and also sort of think and process the violence yesterday that was occurring in the nation. I did want to say that as a result of that, I hope that for some of you who are thinking about this and sitting in this board meeting and wondering what we're doing here, I do want to say that I think that activities like what we saw yesterday, they do really help me in renewing my commitment to working in the public sector and towards accomplishing the goals that you as a board establish, towards, supporting equity, towards engagement, towards transparency, and towards creating a transportation system that helps people and helps people access opportunities. So I wanted to thank you all again. I wanted to thank staff as well, and again, other members coming here for engaging in this sometimes seemingly bureaucratic process. But this is exactly the kind of process that is, I think, a commitment to the democracy that our country embraces. So with that context setting, I would like to spend a little extra time today on my executive director's report as it shows in the agenda. The reason for that is, in addition to making a few statements, general announcements, I wanted to provide you with the update that I'd hoped to provide you at the last meeting when I had internet troubles about where we are in our CTPS strategic planning process. So that'll make this take a little bit longer, but I hope to wrap up within 15 minutes and not take too much of the time on the agenda. But with that, I'll first make a couple general announcements, pause for questions if you have any, then talk about the strategic plan, pause for questions, and then talk about today's agenda very, very briefly. So first and foremost, I wanted to give you a few staffing updates. CTPS, our new Deputy Executive Director, Gina Peril, did start last week during the holiday week. She's not with us today. She had a pre-existing conflict with today's meeting before we made her the offer. So she's very much looking forward to attending and meeting you all at the next MPO meeting. So please look forward to that. And I also wanted to announce that we have another new staff, a more junior staff person, but Julie Dombrowski has come to us to the Traffic Analysis and Design group. And as a refresher, that's the group that does the corridor studies that there's a lot of interest in, a lot of our traffic analysis, the group that carries out the congestion management process, where our freight planning is housed, our bike program, and among other things. And so she has joined this group, adding some capacity to the work that they do. And I'm sure you will see her in the coming months as she sort of comes to you to present some of the work that she engages in with that group. The next announcement I have is that staff asked me to elaborate on for you a little bit is that we are now embarking on an update to the equity language. As a reminder, there is an equity goal that you all as a board adopted as part of the Destination 2040, the last long-range transportation plan. And as a reminder, that's your 20-year planning document that really sets all of the goals and underlies all the work that we as staff do to support you. You have an equity goal in that plan, but you've been discussing over the last number of months and approving a much greater emphasis being placed on equity in the TIP criteria, the criteria used to select capital projects. So we think that it is the right time to start to take the next step to sort of broadening out that deeper commitment that you're expressing into the goals in the LRTP. Now, we are working on the LRTP update. We're just starting it. It will be adopted, the next one, in 2023. So this may seem early, but it's really not. It's a huge process. And so as we start to talk about equity and then start to engage in the needs assessment, we will be reviewing all of the goals with the board, but the equity goal is going to be one of the first and foremost ones that we are talking about. And to support that, as well as to further engage the equity community, populations, supporters beyond the board, we are exploring the idea of establishing a new equity task force. And that task force would have the goal of general engagement and also would likely focus on tasks like providing input into updating the equity goal. We would build off of the success at this point of the DIDB working group, which I and a number of the board members did participate in, which was meant to be sort of a more inviting and less formal than, say, for example, the board meetings, way to engage with the public and key stakeholders to sort of get their input and then bring that to the board. So to advance that, we are aiming to host an initial planning meeting about that task force with some select folks, some select stakeholders at the end of this month to get some input on the structure and content of what that task force might look like. And so you'll hear more from us on that. And then we bring the outcomes of that planning meeting to the board for your discussion and sort of approval on how to move forward. So I hope that was clear. I mean, this is early, but we will come back to you to discuss this further. But we wanted to make sure you had a heads up so that if you had any questions, suggestions, thoughts, you could reach out at this point to Betsy Harvey or Kate White, who will be taking the lead on organizing this. So again, we'll welcome any of your feedback. And if you have any questions, let us know. And before I pause for any questions about these announcements, I'll also give you a few of our outreach updates, which I try to give you on a regular basis. So first, I will mention that staff are very excited to host, in collaboration with MAPC, the next winter Inner Core Committee Transportation meeting. It will be on January 13th, and the topics will include things that we've been working on, like trip generation rates, Vision Zero strategies, safety performance targets, and upcoming MPO studies, such as those on curb management and access to central business districts in the pandemic recovery. So this January 13th virtual session is taking place in addition to the regularly scheduled Inner Core Committee subregional meeting. It is also not too late to register for an event this afternoon, which is the MPO 101, and it's for new board members, but also for existing board members. If you're new, we strongly ask that you talk to staff and attend this 101 session at some point. But existing board members are very welcome. It's a great place to sort of ask questions and explore the role of the board. So it will be at 2:30 p.m. this afternoon, and you can go to the MPO calendar to register. And lastly, I occasionally can skim chats as I'm talking, but I did see one chat come to me about this topic, so I wanted to be sure to mention it. Some may have noticed that I ended up in a Wall Street Journal article about the future of post-pandemic commutes. That was only a small quote in the larger context of the article, and I would say that I think my quote was a bit in contradiction to the general direction of the article, and I'll explain that a little more. But I was contacted by a Wall Street Journal journalist because people were interested in the regional perspective in this article about post-pandemic commuting. And I pointed them to the governor's congestion report, and I pointed them to the chair of the board and to the vice chair of the board. And I'm not sure that they ever actually followed up on those connections. But in talking to me, I made it clear that we are the group that provides decision support tools to the board. And one of the points that I tried to make, I think the journalist was very interested, if you haven't read the article, in kind of pointing out that commuting was going to be better post-pandemic because more people would be working from home, and that might reduce congestion. And my response to that is something that I hope that you all can identify with, which is that it's more complicated than that. And that if we don't do things like invest in public transit as the backbone of a sustainable and equitable transportation system, that's going to sort of combat the idea that working from home will result in less trips and less commuting. So I tried to emphasize that importance of investing in other modes of transportation and not simply relying on driving being easier in the future. So I'm happy to share that. If folks haven't seen it, again, the article is not exactly in the direction that I would prefer to sort of message, but I think it's certainly an interesting reference or thing to look at if you haven't looked at it. And then finally, I was reminded actually to, let me check my note here, mention that there is also an A&F committee, an Administration Finance Committee, coming up on the 21st at 9 a.m. So in advance of the next MPO board meeting. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to Haral Gandhi or any staff to ask questions about that. So I want to just pause there after the general updates before I get into the strategic plan, Mr. Chair, just to see if there are any questions, clarification questions. I think I see Len.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just a curiosity question, Tegan. So why would the Wall Street Journal reach out to someone from the Boston MPO?
So this is something I think it will be good for the MPO to discuss as we move forward. And this also relates to the CTS strategic planning, but people do care about regional perspectives, right? And what the goals of a region might be. You know, they talked to educational institutions and they talked to, you know, politicians and others. And somewhere in that process, I think through an institutional reference that they had, it was suggested, hey, you should really reach out to some or one of the bigger MPOs in the nation to see what they're thinking about in terms of the future of congestion. And so I don't know how they ended up deciding to reach out to the Boston region MPO, but that's how they got my contact information. And so trying to message to them, you know, that there's a policy board and then there's a support, you know, technical staff is an interesting challenge to try to navigate. So I think I hope that you all recognize that what you do is important and that there will be times when people are really interested in getting that regional perspective. And we should talk further in the future about how we might navigate that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I think also now as members of AMPO, I'm going to forget what, but the Association of MPOs in the nation, there's a greater opportunity to leverage that network as well to sort of connect with MPOs at a more national scale. So that's another thing that the board can keep in mind. Anything else before I move on?
I don't see anything, Tegan.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to give you an update, hopefully just a 5 minutes or less update on where we are with our strategic planning process. There are no sort of outcomes or recommendations yet, but as with many things, I think it's useful to check in at sort of an intermediate point before we get to that point. So just as a reminder, especially for anyone new who wasn't a part of the conversations earlier, CTPS, as staff of the Boston Region MPO, is engaging in a strategic planning process that is really focused on CTPS as an organization and how we do our work to support the MPO and other work that we do. So it's a more internal facing strategic plan. And it is complicated because we are not trying to create recommendations that are directives towards the direction of the MPO, but there are some outcomes of this process that may be useful for the MPO board to consider as you approach your next step of creating an operations plan as recommended through the federal certification process. So it's complicated, but we have some good engagement in it. And it's also complicated because as an organization, we are a separate staff, but we do have a fiduciary agent agreement with MEPC, which is the vice chair of the board. And we also do kind of that separate fee for service, separately funded work at times for other agencies who also sit on this board. So we'll work on navigating that with you. And I would say that one of the primary mechanisms we have for having those conversations so far is our very large steering committee. And while it is a large cross-section of staff at all levels and intended to be a staff-driven process, we do have engagement on that committee from several people here, including MEPC, Eric Barassa, including a representative from MassDOT-OTP, Ben Mueller, including Len Diggins as chair of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council and a board member, and also, of course, a representative from our federal partners, Ken Miller, who's an ex officio member of the board. So our steering committee does include all of those folks. And so far, they've been engaging in a process of really collecting information and setting the tone for how we move forward. So far, there have been quite a few interviews and focus groups. There have been 25 folks who've been interviewed individually, and almost 100 have participated in 12 different focus groups. And many of you participated in that, and I thank you very much for that time. The consultants also carried out a peer review process and collected a lot of information on, I think, roughly 10 MPOs across the nation for comparison. And that was all compiled into an organizational assessment. And this is not something that we've shared more broadly as of yet, because the organizational assessment itself is really a compilation of all of that input in ways that haven't necessarily been kind of vetted through into what could be actual recommendations from the plan. There are lots of thoughts and ideas. Not all of them are feasible. Not all of them are really CTPS questions. Some of them are MPO questions or other questions, and some of them are in conflict with each other. So we have this great compilation of all of this input. And from that, the steering committee and the consultants have developed 8 categories that we're going to launch into for creating recommendations. And I'll just briefly read them out. They're sector leadership, the programs and services that we carry out, the governance, which again, there's a lot of overlap there with potential MPO board considerations, and we'll navigate that with you. Organizational structure and staffing internally, diversity, equity, and inclusion, marketing and public presentation, and the last one is funding and operations. So those are the categories in which we'll explore recommendations. And recently we also had a retreat where we talked about CTPS's mission, vision, goals, certainly many of that related to the MPO goals, but aligning them with a set of core values that involve collaboration, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion, honesty, trust, and integrity, professionalism and excellence, and transparency. So these are the sort of the core values that we as an organization are grounding ourselves in our plan moving forward. So with that background, our next step is going to be to develop rough objectives, and we will refine those into actions. And we'll look at actions in each of those areas I mentioned and think about the associated costs and what potential prioritization would be over the next 5 years. So that is what we're really diving into. It's really the thick of it. And I hope in, I don't know how long exactly right now, but hopefully a month or two, a few months, we'll come back to you with much meatier sort of specific ways in which the strategic plan recommendations are evolving. So that was just my verbal summary for today. I just wanted to pause and see if there are any additional questions. And I'm happy to come back to the board at a later date with much more information.
Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to increase confidence in the steering committee by also mentioning that Brian came from the advisory board.
Thank
is
you.
on it. No problem.
Thank you. I forgot about that. I don't know how I could have, Brian, forgotten about you. It's impossible.
I don't know. I mean, I can't, so I just had to let everyone know. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Others have questions for Tegan? I don't see any.
No comeback from Brian. All right.
I'm sure he'll wait till later for that one, Tegan. So
Okay, good. Sounds good.
if there's any other questions, so thank you for that update, Tegan. Why don't we
Okay, so-
move to the next agenda item, public comments?
There was one last thing in my update. I'm so sorry, Steve. I know this is a long one. The last thing I wanted to do is just setting the stage for today's agenda. I think most of it is self-explanatory and will be discussed plenty, but I did want to comment on the action item that is towards the end, simply because I know sometimes people either lose focus or have to go on to other things. And I just wanted to highlight that topic on staff-generated research, I think is a really important example of how you as a board have chosen to invest over the last few years at least a small pool of funding towards giving staff sort of the room and opportunity to sort of come up with our own ideas and take risks in the sense that the outcome of those ideas might be really kind of uncertain because they're so far yet very unexplored ideas. So we had a relatively new staff person, Emily Domenico, who you'll hear from later today, who inherited this idea from a previous staff person. And as she'll report, she discovered that while it wasn't feasible to sort of do what was originally intended with the data sources that we have available, she was actually able to morph that into something that I think is very useful. And if the board is interested and wants to sort of commit some further investment into it, we'd be very interested to hear that. So for those of you, I just want to emphasize that would be a really great last topic if you can stick around and join us for that. And that, Mr. Chair, completes my report.
All right, any questions on the last piece? Okay, sorry about that, Tegan. So we're on to the next agenda and public comments. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the board today?
We have a comment from Janie Dretler.
All right, go ahead, Ms. Dretler.
Hi, Janie Dretler. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm on the Sudbury Select Board. I am the board chair, and I just wanted to give you a quick update that if you haven't already heard, Sudbury voted to acquire the CSX corridor on the southern, hopefully, portion of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. And we have closed on that property, and that would bring the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail from just north of Route 20 through South Sudbury to the Framingham line. And then we have also contracted with a consultant for the 75% design for the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. So I just want to let you know we are making progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone have any questions for Mr. Dretler? All right, seeing none. Other members that would like to address, members of the public address the board today. I'm not seeing anyone. Jonathan, you seeing anyone?
Seeing no one.
All right, Matt. No. All right, last chance. I guess we'll move to committee chairs report. Are there any committee chairs have reports today? I believe there are none, but just want to double check. All right, so we'll move on to agenda item six, which is the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've had no meetings, but our upcoming meeting on this coming Wednesday will feature Kate Victor from MassDOT, who will talk to us about the Shared Streets program, and our own Executive Director, Hagan, who will talk with us about anything she wants to talk to us about. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Leonard. Any questions for Leonard? All right, seeing none, we're on to our first action item on agenda item 7. It's approval of MPO meeting minutes. I believe the first one is November 19th. When I ask for motion a second, please remember to identify yourself and your affiliation. We'll do each one of these separately. Can I get a motion a second to approve November 19th, 2020 minutes, please?
Brian Kane.
I move approval, Mr. Chairman. Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board.
Thank you, Brian. Is there a second?
Eric.
Eric Barassa, I second that motion.
All right. Are there anyone who would like to comment on the minutes, whether changes, comments, questions? All right. Brian, go ahead. You have a question, or are you just starting to vote?
No, I forgot to lower my hand, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, all right. Okay, I don't see any questions. So Jonathan, why don't you read the roll for November 19th?
Okay, Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Okay, and I believe Heather Hamilton has come in from Brookline since we did the roll call.
Heather Hamilton for Brookline, yes.
Thank you. Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, City Beverly votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
That calls roll, Mr. Chairman. Your motion passes.
All right, thanks, everyone. So now we will move to December 3rd. Can I get a motion a second for the December 3rd, 2020 minutes, please?
Eric.
Eric Barassa, I make a motion to move the December 3rd, motion for approval of the December 3rd minutes.
And Tina.
Yes, I second that motion.
All right, Jonathan. Well, first, are there any questions or comments on the minutes anyone would like to make? All right, Jonathan, please read the roll.
Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Katzis,
Katzis, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Gina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable abstain, and one correction, Mr. Chairman. I was not in attendance on the December 3rd meeting.
Okay, that'll get fixed.
Thank you.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, now we'll move on to the December 17th, 2020 minutes. Can I get a motion second to approve those?
Tina,
Yes, make a motion to approve the December 17, 2020 minutes as drafted.
All right, is there a second?
Thatcher,
I will second that motion.
Thank you. All right, any questions or comments on the minutes? Or changes? All right, seeing no one raise a hand. Jonathan, please read the roll.
Stephen Wolfall,
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Yes.
Tom Katzis,
Justin Tsai, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Gina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jonathan. On the next item, which is action item, federal fiscal years 2021 to 2025. HIP Amendment 2, agenda item 8. Matt, go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. Today, I'm here to discuss Amendment 2 to the federal fiscal years 2021 through 2025 TIP. Amendment 2 includes the reallocation of transit capital funds to cover operating expenses as a part of the MBTA's Forging Ahead initiative. These changes are in response to the disruption in system ridership caused by COVID-19 and the resulting drop in fare revenue. When we originally discussed this amendment at the December 3rd MPO meeting, Samantha Silverberg from the MBTA walked this board through the content of the amendment in a highly detailed fashion. With that in mind, I won't repeat those details here today, though we certainly welcome any questions you may have during the discussion here in just a minute. For those interested in reviewing the amendment in more detail, supporting materials have been posted to the MPO meeting calendar for your reference. Amendment 2 was released for a 21-day public review period on December 7th. The comment period closed on December 28th, and no public comments were submitted during that time. As you likely know, the MBTA has made significant efforts to gather public feedback on forging ahead through dedicated public meetings and comment periods at recent Fiscal and Management Control Board meetings. So even though comments weren't submitted through the TIP amendment process, there's been no shortage of opportunities for members of the public to engage with these proposals more broadly. So that's all I have on Amendment 2, and with that, I will turn it back over to the chair for questions and a final vote on endorsement.
All right, thanks, Matt. Before I open up for a motion second to approve, Samantha, do you want to add anything? Yes, I see you raise your hand. Go ahead, Samantha.
Hey, everyone. So I value the collaboration and transparency that we've had with the board, and I wanted to address something straight up, which is, as you've probably seen in the news, the most recent COVID relief bill included funding for transit agencies. The MBTA is awaiting FTA guidance on the precise amounts that we will receive, and we will be discussing our strategy for using those funds with the Fiscal and Management Control Board on Monday. That said, we're asking to proceed with this vote because it will provide the MBTA with the maximum flexibility to maintain and eventually restore service on modes and routes with durable ridership. Your endorsement of the TIP amendment will allow the T to apply formula funds for preventative maintenance costs, which, as Matt summarized, is a critical element of managing us through the impacts of COVID-19. Any further changes to our federal program would be presented and discussed during the annual MassDOT-MBTA CIP process and the TIP development process later this spring. So with that, I just want to say again that I sincerely appreciate the support and the collaboration of the MPO board throughout the process. I know these are not easy or fun decisions, but I do value and appreciate your partnership and engagement. Thank you. That's all I have. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Samantha. Eric, you have your hand raised, correct?
Yes, no, I appreciate that, Samantha. So just to be clear, you guys are seeking the maximum flexibility, but it's still, you're still developing the exact plans. And so it's not like 100% that all these projects necessarily will be delayed, et cetera. That's still part of the mix of what is being decided, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, great.
Any others have any comments? All right, so can I get a motion, a second, to approve TIP amendment number 2, please?
Eric?
Yeah, I will make the motion to approve TIP amendment 2.
Leonard?
I second.
All right, anyone, last chance for any questions? All right. Leonard, do you have a question, or you just have your hand up from before? I just want to make sure you don't have a question.
Sorry about that. I was just leaving it up for the vote. Sorry.
Okay, just want to make sure I get it to everyone. All right, with that, it seems like no one has any questions. Jonathan, please read the roll.
Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kazis,
Kazis, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
Yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. We will move on to agenda item 9, action item. It's the Providence MOU. Jonathan?
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good morning. As required by federal statute, MPOs are required to formalize coordination across multiple MPOs for a single UZA area, which is an urbanized area as defined by the U.S. Census. So as defined by that statute, where those borders and boundaries of the urbanized areas extend across 2 or more MPOs, or even in case states, those appropriate MPOs and the adjoining public transportation operators are strongly encouraged to work together to coordinate transportation planning to ensure consistent development of LRTPs and TIPs, as well as any transportation investments that extend across the boundaries. So as such, many of you will probably remember that a couple years ago, the Boston MPO updated its MOU following its recertification. And the number of signatories that were on it were a number of the MPOs that abut the Boston MPO region, as well as into Rhode Island and southern New Hampshire. So this is being led, in this case, by the Rhode Island Division of Statewide Planning, because part of the Providence urbanized area comes into our region. And so as such, we're a partner. So what they're asking for is for the MPO to just vote to endorse this, similar to what the other signatories are doing.
All right. So can I get a motion and a second to approve the Providence UZA MOU? And I'll open up any questions for Jonathan.
Eric?
Yes, I'll make the motion to approve the this urbanized area memorandum of understanding.
Looks like Brian's next. Brian?
Second that motion, sir.
All right. Any questions on the Providence UZA MOU? All right, seeing none, Jonathan, please read the roll.
Stephen Wolfall.
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Looks like I missed Mr. Romano. John Romano has now joined the meeting.
John Romano, yes.
Thank you. Eric Barassa.
Yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis.
Kadzis, yes. Thank
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Jay Monty.
Yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton.
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent.
Yes.
Thatcher Keyser.
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn.
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy.
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable.
Jen Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier.
Peter Pelletier, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Great. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. We're on to the next agenda item, which is another MOU. Agenda item 10, it's an action item. It's for the Worcester UZA. Jonathan, please go ahead.
Right. So just like we just did for the Providence UZA, the Worcester urbanized area, through their recent federal certification, has updated their MOU. As such, part of that Worcester UZA comes into the very western part of our region, and as such, we're named as a signatory on the MOU. So they're asking for a similar vote that we just took for the Providence one.
Thatcher, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I will move to endorse.
Is there a second? Eric?
Yes, I second that.
All right, any questions on the Worcester UZA MOU? All right, seeing none, Jonathan, please read the roll.
Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Eric Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. Now we're on to agenda item 11, the item that Tegan talked about earlier, using United States Census data as a proxy for transit right survey data. So Emily, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Sounded good.
Yes.
Good, thank you. Okay, just checking. All right, hello, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Emily DeMonico. I'm a transit planner from CTPS's Transit Analysis and Planning Group. And as Tegan mentioned at the beginning, I'll be talking about a staff-generated research project in which we studied how US Census data might be used as a proxy for transit rider survey data. Next slide. So to start, I'll briefly touch on why we wanted to take this project on. Transit rider demographic data are an important input into how we analyze the transit system use. It's specifically important in things like service equity analyses. Ideally, transit rider demographic data are gathered through passenger surveys, where you talk to actual transit riders. However, surveying passengers is not always an available option, especially in cases where new service is added or service is significantly changed. In other words, it's impossible to survey riders that potentially don't exist yet. So we approach this project with the question of, could US Census demographic data fill in the gaps where ridership surveys are not yet available? Specifically, we were asking if census data could help find likely transit riders where we have not yet gathered ridership demographic data. Next slide. And to put that a little bit more graphically, for the purposes of addressing this research question, we started with the general assumption that the population of a service area could be split into two categories, that of transit riders and non-transit riders. And we wanted to see if we could find demographic trends in the service areas with known transit rider demographics, in other words, where we have survey data, to then predict ridership in a new service area, which would consist of two populations, likely transit riders and likely non-transit riders. Next slide. And for our data for the study, okay, you're good.
Sorry,
there.
technical issue on my end. My apologies.
No worries, they switch a little bit, it's fine. And so for our data for the study, our demographic data for the service area is coming from the US Census. And known ridership demographic data came from the most recent system-wide passenger survey that CTPS conducted for the MBTA. Next slide. All right, so more on the data. When we started tackling the project, we made some decisions on how to scope the study based on the data available. Namely, we decided to focus on key bus routes to have sufficient data or better than the whole system data responses from the ridership survey. We narrowed in on survey responses where home-based trips were reported and a boarding stop location was identified. And I'll highlight that the boarding stop location was particularly important for this work as we wanted to analyze demographics at a sub-route level. So not because acknowledging that routes span many demographic areas and communities, and we wanted to think about things at a sub-route level. And then from the census, we pulled American Community Survey data, ACS data, that most closely matched the time period and demographic questions from the passenger survey. And I'll pause here to note that neither the ridership survey nor the ASC data are, ACS, American Community Survey, data are free of biases. Like all surveys, they come with inherent biases connected to their methodology, response rates, and non-response rates. And we kept that in mind as we were trying to analyze and put these things together. They are still the best available data sets to address a research question, so move forward with them. Next slide. Once we had our data, we needed to come up with a method to relate stop level demographic data from our survey responses to census geographies. We decided to aggregate stop level survey data into groups of 5 consecutive stops along the route in the same direction. We did this because we didn't have enough survey response or a sufficient survey response rate throughout the system to analyze demographics at an individual stop level, but we also wanted to keep the analysis more local than an entire bus route. Stop groups were then buffered and compared with overlapping census block groups. Demographic data for bus stops and the census block groups were summarized as percentages of the populations they described. And on the screen here, we have an example of the stop group of an example stop group on Route 117 for the inbound direction with a half-mile merged buffer in purple and the overlapping census block groups in dark gray. So we did this throughout the system for all key bus routes, and we had many demographic summaries to sift through. Next slide. And in order to sift through those summaries, we started making some visualizations to figure out where to go from there. These visuals were developed into an application where users can compare demographic summaries of known transit riders from the MBTA system-wide survey with the demographics of the census. And you're welcome to follow the link on the screen and explore the application. The link is also in the technical memo for the MPO meeting notes for the memo corresponding to this presentation. In the Survey to Census app, we have a map-based view shown in the screenshot on the left of your screen and a table-based view shown on the right. Both views display the demographic summaries described previously in the methods section, directly comparing the survey and census percentages. Next slide. And there's one more important way of viewing the demographic summaries, which we'll pause on here because this is where we determined that given the inputs from the ridership survey and the census, we don't have sufficient data to predict likely transit riders in a new unstudied service area. So on the screen here, we have an example of a third view offered in the Survey to Census application under the Explore Survey Responses tab. The top graph on the screen is comparing survey and census demographic categories for minority status along all variations of Route 1. The color of the points notes the minority status as minority, non-minority. The size of the points notes the number of survey responses found for the stop group in the ridership survey. The location of the point along the horizontal axis corresponds to the ridership survey population percentage for the stop group. And the location on the vertical axis for this point, for all the points, represents the percentage of the population in the service area based on the census data. Where the percentages match up represents a close relationship between the census and survey demographic data. And where they differ, you start to see where one population is more represented in one data source than the other. Next slide. So I know that's a lot. We're going to focus on a slightly less complicated example to unpack the trends that you can find in these plots. And for that, it's helpful to look at the gender, sex, demographic summaries along Route 1. You'll notice that across the service area, the census reports a male-female population split at about 50%. Most of the points are concentrated in the same line at about 50% on the y-axis. And then focusing on the survey responses, we see some grouping happening, and that men/males represented by the blue-green circles are consistently less than the yellow, representing survey responses identifying as women. The demographic categories split in the ridership survey responses in a way that they don't split in the census data source. So next slide. And this pattern holds generally for all key bus routes shown in the plot on the right. And from there, we can start to try to find some patterns here or make some conclusions here. And we could, three options kind of result from that. So this could suggest that 1, a higher proportion of women ride the bus. 2, there's a higher response rate from women than men on the ridership survey. Or 3, a combination of 1 and 2. And next slide. And this ambiguity in option number 3 leads us to our major finding from this work, in that the MBTA ridership survey is representative of riders, but is an imbalanced data set of service area residents. And an imbalanced data set is one where the distribution of examples across known classes is skewed to one population over another. In terms of this study, it assumed that people living in an area surrounding transit will either be a transit rider or a non-transit rider. The ridership survey only supplies demographic data for transit riders, which means that our data set does not represent both potential classes evenly. And it's important to note that while the transit survey responses are an imbalanced data set relative to all residents of a service area, it's still a careful and interesting survey of transit riders, which is what that survey was originally designed to do. Just doesn't help us with this question specifically. So due to the lack of data on non-transit riders, we decided that we're not able to create a model that would identify likely transit riders from non-likely transit riders. And to explain this with an analogy, let's suppose that there's a jar of 1,000 marbles. Half the marbles are green and the other half are orange. For this analogy, let's say an individual green marble weighs on average 10% less than an orange marble, but we don't know this. We want to try to find this out. Now, we sampled 20 green marbles, recording their weight, texture, and diameter. With this data, you can make claims about the characteristics of green marbles. If you use this data to predict if a marble is green or orange based on its weight, texture, and diameter, a model may predict that all marbles are green, despite the average difference in weight between green and orange marbles. We didn't find any information about orange marbles. We have no orange marble data. So due to the imbalance in our sample data of only green marbles, we cannot train a model to detect the difference between green and orange marbles. Now, if we go back and sample both orange and green marbles, we might be able to gather training data about the differences and be able to predict the color of marbles based on other characteristics. So acknowledging that demographic data and people in the real world are much more complicated than the characteristics of marbles, I think the analogy is still helpful in pointing out what's preventing us from reliably predicting likely transit riders based on our current data sets. Next slide. And to sum up here and look forward to what we can do in the future, we came to the conclusion that we do not have sufficient data from the passenger-wide survey to address the original research question, which asked to find demographic trends to predict likely transit riders in a new service area. A possible path forward to pursue those trends would be to conduct a future demographic survey designed to to conduct a future demographic survey for a defined service area. And that survey could be designed to survey both transit riders and non-transit riders. From there, we could start to quantify the relationship between transit riders and non-transit riders and use that relationship in a comparison to the census data to extrapolate a little bit more reliably than based on what we have now. And with that, I'm happy to take questions about the project and our findings. And I'm also happy to field questions about the application too. It's a little bit challenging without a live demo, but I'm happy to take those as well.
All right, thank you, Emily. Anyone have any questions for Emily? Daniel?
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for this work. I did read the memo. I thought it was very interesting. And I do have a couple of questions. The first one, I'll just run through them, or two that come to mind. Can you define what you mean by transit riders versus non-transit riders? I think, you know, is a transit rider somebody that rides once a week, once a month? You know, what is the threshold, or what is the definition of who's transit or non-transit? And secondly, I find this sort of fascinating. It seems like I mean, interesting. We have a lot of information about transit riders, or we know the demographics of transit riders, and I suppose, I don't know if there's an assumption that non-transit riders are sort of not that, or I don't know, the opposite of what transit riders are, or just sort of, there's sort of inferences, I guess, that are made about non-transit riders based on what we know about transit riders. So I'm curious how that plays into this, because it's sort of I mean, I guess you look at likely transit riders based on the existing demographic of, you know, existing transit riders, right? And so seems like that's where you target, or that's how you determine a likely transit ridership for a new service. So it's interesting to see that what you're saying is that we sort of make this assumption, but we don't actually have the data to back that up. Is that sort of what you're saying? So those are my two questions.
Sure, yeah. So in response to the first one, as to the definition of transit rider versus non-transit rider, I agree, it is very synthetic and generalized, and I don't necessarily think that that's a clean way to divide up the population. I would look to the way that the MBTA ridership survey asked about ridership, and that was to ask respondents to report their most recent trip using a T service, an MBTA service, and then that's how they were recorded as being a rider of the MBTA. For if we were going to try to figure out what that would be in a future survey as to grouping people into a transit rider versus non-transit rider, I think you would maybe have to have some sort of time period and ask if they've used a T service in the past month, 3 months, something that you would feel comfortable defining that as. But it does require more definition. It is a little bit of a hairy distinction, but we made at the beginning of this project to see if it could help us articulate something, and it didn't necessarily. So I think that that's also pointing to maybe some of the artificial quality of that distinction as well. And as to your second point about if we can get non-transit riders as an inference of just like the opposite of transit riders, I think that's an interesting point, but I think you're still missing some component of what non-transit riders could be. If you're assuming that you have no bias in your information on transit riders, then you could maybe make that assumption. But given that in order to have an output that has meaning, you need to quantify your error and know your biases and the assumptions that you're making along the way. I think that it's worth pausing and noting that you don't have any direct information on non-transit riders if you move forward with just transit rider demographic data. Does that address questions?
Yeah, thank you for the second part. I think what I was saying was that it seems like that's how we do it now, not necessarily that's the right way to do it, but I guess making inferences about non-transit riders based on what you know about transit riders, but not necessarily having sort of the backup on non-transit riders, which is what this study is looking at. And so and for the first point, I would consider myself a transit rider, or at least I used to, but I don't think I've used transit in the last 10 months. So, right. So I would certainly use it, but right now is not, I guess, hasn't been the time for me. But anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, that is something important to note. Sorry, briefly.
No, go ahead, Emma.
Is that both of these data sources are pre-pandemic, and this project was started pre-pandemic, and as the pandemic has changed how we think about everything, I think this would also be an important caveat here, and that we have more questions that we don't know now than we did before.
All right, thank you. Samantha, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Emily, for this helpful presentation. I'm curious, I assume that you've engaged with the OPMI rider survey team. What was their feedback to this analysis?
So we haven't directly, and that would be definitely a good next step if we were to continue with any of this. I pulled in the ridership survey demographic data from CTPS's database, and then once we sort of came to this conclusion, we kept proceeding with developing the tool and articulating our concern. But yeah, I think the point to look towards OPMI's team would be very wise to move forward and continue to articulate our findings here.
Yeah, maybe a point of collaboration moving forward, because I know that Tegan and I have been talking a lot about collaboration between the T and CTPS, and MassDOT and the T and CTPS. So maybe we can have a regular kind of research collaboration session, because I would hope that materials like this are if not vetted, at least shared with those folks in advance of a public presentation. So thanks, and thanks for the collaboration.
All right, next one up is David, and then I have Leonard afterwards. Go ahead, David.
Okay, thank you. So I thought this study was very helpful, and I appreciate it. In terms of future work, and maybe this touches directly on Daniel's comments, just thinking, how can we try to capture riders by choice, right? These, we clearly study them less. And, these are the people that would not be showing up in the census demographics, the block groups that you talked about, but they're people who choose to ride transit for environmental reasons, or maybe they're riders by convenience, right? As long as service stays convenient for them. Maybe they live in an area that was developed around commuter rail stations, or have park and ride service, or ferry service or something. So I just think it would be interesting, maybe especially at this point, to try to capture more what it means to be a rider by choice based on convenience, and at what point would ridership start to break down when the convenience is reduced. And I don't know if any or much of this, maybe some things can be found in the census, but it's, and it's not really exactly related to this study, but it's something that I've been thinking about lately.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thought, and it definitely points out a limitation that I sort of found while thinking about this is that your demographics don't really determine whether you take the bus or not. I mean, they may play a component, they may be part of that information that we can capture through sources. But I think, you know, it doesn't replace really good route planning or, you know, reliable service or all of these other metrics that would also be a component in determining whether you want to take the bus or not, or need to. So yeah, I guess it's important to point out that the demographics are not the end of the question here, and there are many other factors that could come into thinking about whether people would take transit or not.
Right, and it's not something that we would find out through the ridership survey necessarily. Maybe, or maybe someone else knows that answer, but so thank you for this work.
All right, Leonard.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily, for this read. The staff generated research is my favorite line in the UPWP, and I'll just kind of do my little take on oh, what was that movie? Life is staff generated research is like a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're gonna get, but you know it's gonna be good. And this is really good, and your apps are really good too. And I'll just repeat what Tegan said. I mean, about the nature of this research. In some respects, it can be considered negative results, but they are important results. And I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to invite you to come to one of the Rider Oversight Committee subcommittee meetings, because I think we could really dive into this a lot. I know there are some people who'd really be interested in talking with you more about this, and I appreciate your participation in our meetings already. And I'm just going to switch over to another screen here to get at my own question. Was there a similar project that had been proposed in a previous cycle of the UPWP? This is something about this just kind of rings a bell, and maybe it was before your time.
Yeah, I don't know if I could speak to the entire history of it because I definitely came in after it was proposed. I think it was maybe in an initial. Like it was in a form where it was going to be an official study, and then it got moved to staff-generated research at a later point. So you may be thinking of a previous iteration, but that is the extent of the history that I could comment on there.
Okay, and David actually touched on the other thing that I was going to mention, and that is that to the extent maybe we could tease out from this something that would make being a transit rider more appealing, or something that we could learn about those who use transit that maybe we could either use to encourage people to use it by advertising this is what you get from transit, or build that into however we design a transit system. That was a little convoluted, but essentially what I was getting at is with David's, I like David's follow-up and definitely Samantha's follow-up about working more with MBTA. And so thank you.
All right, I think Sandy wants to add some probably stuff on the history. Go ahead, Sandy.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond to Len's question briefly that yes, this was a concept that was discussed as part of the UP universe, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, and ended up being a staff-generated research project. So you are not misremembering, you are remembering correctly. It was allocated to the staff-generated research in the end.
Thank you, appreciate it.
All right, any others have any questions? All right, I don't see any, so thank you. Oh, wait, Ken, go ahead. Ken?
No, but Mr. Chair, I was a little quick on the trigger. I have a members item, so let me get to that point.
Ken, you've turned into me, who's always jumping ahead. Look at that. Thank you, Emily. I don't think there's any other questions, so thank you. All right, we're on to agenda item 12, members items. Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to mention that I hope folks know that at the end of last calendar year, the There was in addition to the $900 billion COVID relief measure that was passed, also included, by the way, the $1.4 trillion annual appropriations, which fully funds transportation for the rest of this federal fiscal year, which everybody knows ends September 30th. So the normal annual funding, of about $46 billion nationally is assured for the year. But also the COVID relief package, it also included an additional $10 billion that will be allocated to state DOTs through federal highway. This is in addition to the transit funding that Samantha mentioned. And so over the next week, federal highway has 30 days to sort of allocate the funding and let folks know how it's available. It will be available for 4 years. It can be used not only for capital projects, but state DOTs may be able to use it for operations, maintenance, and other things that normally they would not be able to use federal capital funding for. So I just wanted to give folks a heads up, and I guess stay tuned on how and when this funding may be available. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ken. Any other members have any items they'd like to bring to the board today? I see Leonard's hand up. Leonard, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a request. I mean, it's kind of based on the MOUs that we approved earlier, and that is that maybe staff at some point can tell us how these collaborations are done. I'm particularly interested with respect to how we collaborate on the UPWPs, because I mean it's a great idea. It's a good idea. We should do it, and I'd just like to understand better how we do it. So there's no rush on this. So maybe talk to the advisory board independently of the MPO, but it is something I'm very much interested in. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that one, Leonard. We'll look into that. Are there any other member items? Thatcher.
Yes, I just want to give a shout out to the MPO staff. I did take up the offer to participate in a MPO 101 session, and I found it very valuable, and the staff very knowledgeable and informative in that. So I want to give a shout out to those folks that all the MPO staff who participated in that.
All right, good to hear that. Thank you, Thatcher. Anyone else have any other items for the MPO today? Tina.
Very sorry, that was a stray keystroke.
All right, Tegan just put something in the chat to remind everyone there's, I believe, one today, this afternoon. Any other member items? All right, seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn? Eric, is this you making a motion to adjourn? Or did you have a...
Yes, it is. Eric Barassa making a motion to adjourn.
And can I assume, Tom, you're seconding it?
Yes, I am. So I second that.
All right. So I usually don't do roll calls for ending meetings. So for all in favor, would like to adjourn, please say aye. Or raise your hands. Any opposed? All right. Thank you, everyone, for today. We'll see you soon.